researcher's perspective, he's been a real inspiration in the field. He's really been a leader in terms of making the whole analysis of drug policy a scholarly exercise that goes beyond ideology, and I think there's so many areas where he's really led the way in terms of analysing the implications of policy, and I think he's really been the leader for many decades now in terms of making it clear that if we're going to spend a lot of money on drug policy, on drug enforcement, and we're all aware of the social harms and the personal problems related to drug use, we've really got to get our policy right, and we've got to be really rigorous about it and scientific about it, so we get the right balance of what we want to do. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter Reuter, Professor Peter Reuter from the University of Maryland, and he's going to talk to us about our psychoactive substances policy, about that issue around the world, but he also really very interestedly contrast it with changes in cannabis policy which have been happening around the world, and in particular in the United States, where he's been involved in that kind of debate and policy change. So I just want you to introduce Peter Reuter. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm originally Australian, so I grew up ignoring New Zealand, which is the ultimate insult to Australians. Canadians have a fellow feeling that New Zealanders, as you know, because the US ignores them. And it's been wonderful over the last 20 years or so to discover that New Zealand sort of leads the way in all sorts of interesting public policy ventures. I was editor of a journal at one stage, had a symposium about public management innovations in New Zealand, and the Australian said it doesn't make any sense. But I can try to get over that prejudice, and delighted to be here and talking, at least in part, about your particular policies. And what I want to do is put together two live issues. One is the question of marijuana legalization, which 10 years ago in the US and elsewhere, I think was a very marginal prospect. And now, as most of you surely know, has become real in the United States with, first of all, Colorado and Washington, and now 3 other states allowing the legal sale, though they haven't set up their systems yet, and Uruguay still in the process of establishing its system of legal marijuana availability. And I want to sort of start in terms of motivation for this study by this presentation by stating that the movement has largely been about avoiding the bad consequences of prohibition rather than getting enthusiasm for the legalization itself. And I want to sort of be critical about that and suggest why that also, the criticism I'm going to make of that, is relevant to the NPS, new psychoactive substances issues that I'll talk about. And I will also make the point with respect to marijuana that whether legalization works as a public health decision rests very heavily on the relationship between marijuana use and the use of other psychoactive substances, and we are essentially clueless as to what that relationship is. I'll mostly, though, talk about NPS, this being the issue of principal interest here right now, and again suggest that at least in other parts of the world, the principal motivation for considering ways of allowing NPS to enter the market legitimately are about averting harms. And again, that paying attention to substitution is really perhaps the central issue with NPS and gets very little attention. By the way, I might say, I welcome questions and clarification along the way. Points of dispute we can leave to the end, but please don't hesitate to ask questions if there's anything that's obscure as I go along. So, yeah, there are more and more psychoactive substances coming into existence. Just sort of in 1961, when the single convention, the basic international treaty was passed, there were 80 prohibited substances that had more than tripled by 1995. Sasha Shulgin, who is sort of really the father of modern NPS movement, I guess along with Albert Hoffman, noted that back in 1900 there were just 2 psychedelics. Sort of very it's very convenient that we have 2 in 1900, 20 in 1950, and according to his count, 200 in 2000. And you sort of think, well, I guess it's exponential growth, and 2000 and 2050 or something like that. Not indeed an implausible growth. There are many more people who have the skills to make new substances, some of which might turn out to be interesting. And more and more of them are in countries like China, which have pretty weak controls. So we sort of have, on the one hand, a growing supply of people who might do this. The technologies make innovation easier. And of course, globalization. The fact that whether you're in Chile or South Africa, you might be consuming Thailand origin psychoactives is perfectly reasonable. The flow, most illegal drugs move in channels of commerce or traffic. The channels of commerce and traffic are getting thicker between more and more places, so it's easier and easier to move. So there are all sorts of reasons to think that there will be new psychoactive substances, increasing number of them, not only in existence, but increasingly available to populations around the world. And they present, as I'm sure most of you in this audience know, a peculiar regulatory challenge. They require decisions when the scientific knowledge is extremely limited. What exactly are the problems associated with the latest synthetic cannabinoid? It takes years to get that right. And yet decisions have to be made early on because there are now so many channels for marketing that are difficult to control unless you have a strong legal basis for that control. At the moment, in most of the world, a psychoactive substance will be treated as a potential therapeutic and subject to the same kind of tests as would be applied to any therapeutic drug. Of course, that's a misrepresentation of the reality. These are not offered as therapeutic drugs. They're offered as a source of pleasure. There will be dangers associated with it, but treating them in a therapeutic regime is to sort of misclassify them from the very beginning. And the struggle is, this is where New Zealand has been in the forefront, is to see if there's some alternative system that accepts that they are not a therapeutic intent, that they are some other kind of consumer good and should be regulated in that frame rather than as potential therapeutics. So recent experiences with these new substances follow a common pattern. The substance sort of enters grey markets through the internet. There are these boutique stores, and in Switzerland you have stores that really do sell hemp products, and then they sell other things. And those other things are typically not yet subject to regulation. There will be, if the substance turns out to be of some interest, interest to the market, you'll get reports of some adverse effects and often a small number of highly publicized fatalities, which have very dubious etiology. It's usually, this drug was involved, but there were 2 other drugs as well, and there were particular circumstances, but the Daily Mail will simply say, new drug kills. And that will be, that's an important sort of background fact for the regulatory decision making. But with that headline as a background fact, some evidence of harms against prohibit that particular substance. Whether that is in fact, I'll get to the question of whether that's a good decision to make with that kind of factual background. And what further makes the decision complicated is that it's fairly clear that there's a sort of chain relationship amongst different substances. So, for a variety of reasons related to supply-side interventions, the quality of ecstasy in many countries has become quite poor. Doesn't have much of the essential ingredients in it. And I mean, it's sort of interesting that I study illegal markets generally. I'm fascinated by the peculiar failure of this market to figure out a way for producers to signal quality so that in fact you can get some authentic MDMA providers. But it seems to be the case that there are countries, the UK quite famously, in which, and the Netherlands, in which if you buy something labeled ecstasy, you have very little idea of what it is you're buying. And over time, that's led to a shift away and a search for other substances that are ecstasy-like and maybe more reliable. And methadone was one of those alternatives developed in face of the failure of the ecstasy market. After methadone was scheduled in the UK, then naphorone, and by the way, my knowledge of chemistry, some of it is very poor. I will mispronounce some things, so I say naphorone and maybe it's naphorone. Was developed sort of as another means of providing ecstasy-like experience and getting rid of methadone. So you sort of relabel what was methadone as naphorone. The market did not know anything about these distinctions. The enforcement wasn't tough enough. It's difficult to enforce regulations involving these relatively rare substances. So you sort of went from the failing ecstasy market to methadone to naphorone. And the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs then scheduled naphorone. Why to do that? Well, it started by sort of noting some important facts, sort of arguing against scheduling. The first one is that there are no confirmed cases of acute toxicity associated with the use of naphorone. Daily Mail headlines, but this was the sort of scientifically correct statement. Secondly, there was no known relationship between naphorone and antisocial behavior or acquisitive crime. Interesting that those enter into scheduling decisions in the context of the UK. However, and now they list a number of considerations that really are not sort of clinical considerations, the kind of things you test in a clinical trial. They noted that the drugs marketed as naphorone often contained other drugs. I mean, is that a basis for not allowing naphorone? And it reflects the reality, but it is an odd decision for an essentially scientific body to be making. Large differences in dose size between naphorone and drugs that is sold under that name, so there was a higher risk of fatal or of doses that would have health consequences. And it was difficult to titrate Nafron because the effective dose was so small. So here we have the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs, which is a mixed body, and it has psychiatrists, public health workers, law enforcement representatives as well on it. Providing, I would say, a very heterogeneous and not particularly compelling set of reasons for scheduling Nafron and basically making the selling of Nafron for recreational purposes illegal. But that's the ACMD itself is very troubled by the way it is doing these exercises for the new psychoactive substances. It's written to that effect. But this is sort of typical of the reasoning that it has provided. Obviously, we know most about the handling of new psychoactive substances through your experience with what I will manage to say, at least occasionally, BZP. I mean, there's not really anything that probably everyone here can recite these facts more fluently than I can. A drug that became suddenly popular in this country before it was prohibited. My understanding is that after Prohibition, you saw a substantial reduction in the prevalence of BZP. It was probably the progenitor of your Psychoactive Substance Act, and I think I incorrectly said suspended in December 2013. What is the right term I should be using for what happened in 2013, December 2013? So,
it's in May this year.
Sorry?
The temporary licenses were removed in May this year.
Okay.
That was all that was done. So, it means
So, my interest here is the structure of your Psychoactive Substances Act. And you identify that the Act identifies, or the supplemental description of the Act, identifies 6 components of risk that are to be taken into account. Toxicological, you can read this, deal with vulnerable populations, etc. And there are 2, and Chris Wilkins has this very nice article in Addiction earlier this year, which makes the point that it's all very well to identify these as 6 distinct domains of risk. The question is, what is the acceptable level within each of those? And how would you go about establishing that? I mean, sort of, how would you go about establishing the criteria that should be used for setting these levels? The Act doesn't provide guidance on this, and I don't think the literature provides guidance on this. What is the take the last one, which I'm in some sense best suited to deal with, the appeal to vulnerable populations. First of all, let's agree, do we know what a vulnerable population is? Appeal to, you mean the relative risk of the vulnerable populations versus the rest of the population? Literally, how do we think about establishing an acceptable level for that? So that's sort of the big thinking problem, conceptual problem. Then you've got the second empirical problem, which is how, given that these drugs are not out there yet, or not out there in the way that they would be if regulated, how do you establish what their appeal actually is going to be? Now, all applications for regulatory authority with respect to a commodity, typically therapeutic drugs, but not restricted to that, could be pesticides and that. Involves some projection, but typically projections that can be done with sort of controlled scientific experiments. This kind of population issue is not something that you can set with scientific experiments. It is, in fact, something that you will observe through the release itself. You sort of step to one side. I was involved in the study of the National Academy of Sciences of harm reduction products, which was for tobacco. And the question that the committee, in the end, led the committee to say we cannot consider harm reduction products was exactly the problem of projecting population consequences. So the issue with tobacco harm reduction, and you see with e-cigarettes, is so how will e-cigarettes or any harm reduction product affect tobacco use, that is conventional tobacco use? Will e-cigarettes be a transitional device, or are they a terminal device? Will we have lifetime e-cigarette users, or is that just a part of it? How do you go about studying that when it's clearly not an individual decision, but the result of social influences? Tobacco, smoking, like drug taking, is a learned behavior. And the committee could not figure out a way in which you could do studies prior to the release of a harm reduction product that would in fact enable you to establish whether the harm reduction product was a transitional device or a traditional mode or terminal, which has bad consequences, bad connotations, but anyway, a stable, non-transitional. You have the same problem here. Risk to public health, again, a lot of this will be the result of how people learn to use the drug, in ways that are more or less dangerous, and we have to know how the society will in fact adapt to this. So I will come back to this, but you can see my skepticism about whether this is a workable frame for making decisions about what's an acceptable level of risk requirement. The European Union has also wrestled with this, and I'm going to talk about a 2005 framework that they established, and just briefly talk about a proposal they made in 2011, which has still not been adopted. But it's interesting to see what they had set up and the way in which they're proposing to change it. In this case, they identified a set of risks much broader than those that are in your PSA. They were concerned with risks associated with use, risks associated with manufacture. What do I mean by that? What do they mean by that? Well, would this be involved with, actually no, so let me go to trafficking. The trafficking. So the question they asked, the question they said had to be asked in making a decision about a new psychoactive substance was whether it was likely to be trafficked by organized crime. And that was one of the criteria that was to be examined. And you sort of ask, how would one go about doing that? And this is, it's not as though we have a body of systematic research about the characteristics of drugs that lead to organized crime involvement. Organized crime involvement is not a binary measure, it's sort of more or less. How much was enough for that to be a problem? But they were raising a whole series, sorry, I've forgotten all the other ones. A series of supply side risk factors revolving around what would happen if it was not made legal. So yours is a set of criteria about if it's legal, what are the risks here? In this case, they were in some sense sort of taking the high road, saying, well, we should also consider the consequences of not making it legal. Would that involve trafficking? But having sort of raised this concept, you'll see in a moment, we don't really get any clarification of that. But they were also interested in what kinds of health and social risks you got from imposing controls. Would that, for example, drive some users to underground consumption, and what were the dangers associated with that? So this is sort of conceptually very rich. Of course, no one ever was able to make that work. This is a system that's been in place since 2005, and what they use is a much simpler system. Is they use the sort of standard assessment for drug scheduling decisions. Is this substance safe and medically useful? We come back to the fact they're not developed for therapeutic purposes, so they can't pass the test of being the preferred treatment for the specified medical condition. Now, for whatever reason, eventually all of these decisions are made on such meager scientific evidence. So this is the EMCDD, the European Monitoring Centre on Drugs and Drug Addiction, sort of explaining its decision on BZP. The absence of standard safety, pharmacology, and toxicology data. Many of the tablets also contain, I won't even try, TFMBP. Most users consume BZP with alcohol as well as other psychoactive substances. They are correctly describing how this drug is used in current circumstances, what it is that is used, it's not just BZP. And how do you separate out from that evidence on BZP itself as used? If the Pfizer Corporation were interested in BZP and saw a large therapeutic market for it, we might be looking at large-scale studies and trials of the drug. But these are drugs that come out of sort of shadowy worlds, and certainly not ones that are in a position to provide funding for those kinds of trials. So, on what basis does the regulator project the future trajectory of use of BZP? I do a lot of work related to cocaine, and I can tell you that we have seen in the US a decline of about 50% in the quantity consumed cocaine in a 5-year period in the US. And I defy you to find anybody who predicted any such change. Complete mystery. We did some work last year, 2013, looking at 2006 to 2010, and observed this. And lots of, we can make a pretty compelling case that this what explains it in describing this. So, emphasizing the difficulty of the task of making projections for these decisions. Sorry, this is slightly. So, the old system, all that's missing up here, somehow my take a snapshot tool wasn't working well, is sort of the EMCDDA and Europol sort of identified the drug as being of potential interest. And in the old system, there was a long set of steps which took had a sort of 2-year line before they got to making a decision. Now they make the decision within a much shorter period. There's a possibility temporary consumer market restriction. And then the notion is that they will classify the drugs into one of three classes. If it's a low-risk substance, then they take no action, and it's permitted in any country in the European Union, and that's the end of the matter as far as the Commission is concerned. If it's classified as moderate risk, then there are restrictions put in place, but there's no criminalization, possession, or even manufacture. If it's high risk, then there's restrictions along with criminal penalties. And this has certain merits. It allows a quicker action. Various other things that aren't really relevant here to let's make representations. But the question is, will they have a basis for making these decisions about risk? Will they be able to classify substances as low risk, medium risk, high risk? And I'm, for the reasons I've already given, the reasons I've developed further, I think there'll be a bias towards avoiding the low risk categorization. Here I'm just hammering home a point that I've sort of made in passing, which is, if let's say that BZP is a low-risk substance, if you know that users will predictably consume it with alcohol, and that combination is dangerous, how do you treat BZP? And I think as a cautious regulator, it is entirely appropriate to say no to that drug. Now, one question which I thought was nicely raised by a Home Office report, which sort of hangs over all of this, is, look, we're regulating markets that if we don't regulate, largely self-regulate. And here's the Home Office report, because what I like is the fact that you're not now just hearing an academic, you're hearing a serious institution making a sort of fairly radical point. It may be that the market to some extent regulates itself with less effective or more harmful psychoactive substances only being seen for very short periods of time or in a limited number of countries. And in fact, if you look at the existing data, there are many drugs that come and go, and drugs tend to be quite specific. These drugs tend to be quite specific to specific countries. Mephedrone had a major impact for a while in the UK market, almost unknown in the rest of Europe, and literally unknown in the US. That is, we went through all the substances listed in the Drug Abuse Warning Network database of drugs that had been mentioned in hospital emergency department admissions and other drugs, and could not find not just the name mephedrone, but any of the sort of standard colloquial meow, is that? And it's a reminder that drugs often are quite market specific. This is sort of a point of, I think, some general interest. To give you an example, I work in Washington, D.C., which is 35 miles from Baltimore. Everyone who's seen The Wire knows a lot about Baltimore. And in Washington, D.C., the drug PCP, really nasty drug, is very common. About 10% of arrestees, arrested for anything, test positive for PCP. It's probably less than 1% in Baltimore. 35 miles, come on, take a train. But it's been that way for decades. Drugs are quite specific, and so that sort of slightly complicates things, because it's not as though you sort of want to be screening through Europe to find out what's the next threat coming your way, the threats may be very specific to your country. These are data on the number of new substances that the EMCDDA and Europol identify as substances for which regulation may be appropriate. They sort of come under the European Commission system. And what you see there is a rapid rise, but it's still worth noting we're talking about, in 2013, about 80 substances. And most of them have essentially disappeared from the market before the regulatory system goes in action. And they're very, this is not, I hope this is good. Here are data from the UK, their household survey, ages 16 to 59. Mephedrone in 2010, about 1.3% of respondents reported use, and that had fallen to a half 2 years later. Other drugs that had been of concern, I do not know what GBL is, but clearly got about 0.1. Spice, slightly popular. BZP, again, sort of faded out, unregulated, faded out. No, I shouldn't say that. It was scheduled back in 2007, faded out. If you were looking at US data, which unfortunately I didn't include here, what you see is that synthetic cannabinoids have become an important part of the market. I think if you look at the Monitoring the Future, the high school survey, something like 11% of high school seniors reported use of synthetic cannabinoids in the previous year. Dramatically different from European figures. And it's not as though the US has high rates of prevalence of marijuana in general, no higher than a number of European countries. So, using these data for two purposes. One here is to sort of suggest that a lot of these drugs don't make much of an impact and disappear fairly rapidly. The second one is that there are real differences across countries in the extent of use of these. So let me talk now about regulation. I'm going to get into, use this as a way to transition to marijuana policy. So what would you like a regulatory system to do? Presented with a new psychoactive substance, surely the question is, what is this likely to do to take the burden, sort of the burden of psychoactive drug use? So if I told you that I have a drug which is harmful, but less harmful than alcohol, and likely to displace a lot of alcohol use, I would say the ideal regulatory system would allow that drug, even if the drug might be cause substantial harms. After all, alcohol causes very substantial harms, and this is sort of causing harms. So you'd like the decision to reflect relationship to other psychoactive substances. And you'd also like to take account of how legalization affects other harms, not related to use itself. So most of my research interests over a long period of time have been with the supply side. And the supply side of drugs for the US and for a number of other countries have been the source of harms quite distinct from use. So, the violence around drug markets. Again, all I have to do is remind you of the wire. I mean, how many of the the terrible things that happen in the wire are about the use of the drug, and how many of them are about the selling of the drug. So one of the things you'd like the regulator to take into account is what are the supply side harms that come from prohibiting this drug. And more controversially, I would argue, you would like it to take into account pleasure. Sally and I were talking about alcohol. Why do we not prohibit this extraordinarily dangerous drug? And the answer, I think, has two components which are very relevant. One is, we know that prohibition doesn't work, and there's actually a contentious point, but it's a universal view. It was tried in the US, it failed, ergo it will fail. And the second is, there are many people who get pleasure from the use of alcohol, from non-risky use of alcohol. There may also be some positive health consequences. And there's lovely studies that find 2 drinks a day is, unless you're Danish, in which case you like 7 beers a day is now, there actually was a study, so am I right? There's some Danish study that has sort of really big number. And so just think, find some Danish genes and you can have as much beer as you want. The pleasures that we get from alcohol surely weigh in our view about the appropriateness of alcoholism. But we do not, and that pleasure certainly involves its psychoactive consequences. It's not merely the taste, the taste is wonderful. It's not merely the taste. And we give that legitimacy. But for no other psychoactive substance do we think that the pleasure that non-addictive users get should play a role in the decision to regulate. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I'm going to come back to that as well. I mean, as an economist, mostly think prohibition is indefensible, and a lot of that comes down to the notion people are buying it voluntarily, then you're getting consumer surplus from it, so you're robbing them of legitimate pleasure. There's a good answer to that. Soft paternalism, we want to reduce temptation, many people start using alcohol eventually, grab it, etc. But consumer surplus is real too. There are drinkers who cause no harm and get pleasure, and we do not think that that's inappropriate. So having been thinking about new psychoactive substances, let's talk about an old one whose regulation is now on the table. I've talked about the countries that have, states, country that have done it. It's actually interesting to me, there have not been a lot of countries that have sort of taken advantage, so to speak, of the fact that the chief drug warrior, the US, now has this sort of mortal wound and thinking actively about marijuana legalization, but clearly there is an interest in this and sort of seeing how things play out. And I'm going to talk about its regulation in the context of recreational use. It's clear that it can be provided for medicinal uses. Whether it truly is medicine is a very controversial matter. If it is medicine, surely there's a better way of delivering it than having people smoke a natural substance, a naturally occurring leaf. And Sativex is one new product that may make a real difference in the sense that you can get most of the therapeutic advantages of THC with a substance where you can control the dosage and where there's not euphoria. We know that marijuana has no risk. It is addictive. About 1 out of 10 users at some stage wants to stop and is unable to stop. We know it's a source of accidents of various kinds. We know, courtesy of the Dunedin study, we have for the first time good evidence about the long-term consequences both for behavior and for development. It would surely fail the test under the new EU NPS regime. There are many harms associated with it. But in fact, the legalization case for marijuana has until now rested primarily on harms averted as compared to prohibition. So in the US, but not exclusively in the US, there's increasing discontent about the way the police use the authority to arrest for marijuana possession. And I suspect many of you know the story about New York City, where back in 1990 there were about 2,000, annually about 2,000 marijuana possession arrests. Rudy Giuliani became mayor, and by the end of his term, they were making about 50,000 marijuana possession arrests, predominantly of minority youth. And there's abundant evidence that the police use this essentially as a tool for control of the populations they saw as being risky. It's sort of fascinating because New York State is a state which decriminalized possession of marijuana. And when I first came across this, bizarre. And then there was a paper which said, well, look, the way they do it is the following. The way the police do it is the following. They stop somebody, ask them to empty their pockets, which the individual can refuse, get arrested. Empty pockets, the young man empties his pockets. And it turns out there's some marijuana in the pockets. That marijuana is now in public view. That's a criminal offense, just a misdemeanor. That's criminal. When I first came across this, I thought this is left-wing paranoia. And now I've seen it fully documented. It isn't. It is what the police did as a matter of routine. I tell that story mostly as an anti-New York story. I think I disapprove of Rudy Giuliani's approach to crime control. Very successful in some respects. But mostly to make the point that it's that kind of event which has really mobilized a lot of people to want to have marijuana legalized. New Zealand, this may not be an issue. I would say in London, it's very much an issue. The police do pretty much what the New York police do in that respect. And you may have a police force that doesn't take the prevention of that. But if you ask why is there now, as compared to 10 years ago, a much larger share of the population in favor of marijuana legalization, that clearly has played an important role. So, that's one thing. There's a concern that it generates large black markets. Black markets are themselves harmful. Some sensitivity to the fact that it's US marijuana consumption that helps generate corruption and violence in Mexico. Takes a lot of attention. Sense that so long as marijuana is illegal, kids that buy marijuana will come in contact with people who sell other drugs as well. So these are harms that the population's come to accept as being associated with prohibition. And those are the principal drivers of the move to marijuana legalization. Now, government revenue, if you say is sort of a positive element, why let organized crime get these revenues and why shouldn't the government get it? That was important in 2010 when the voters of California almost passed a very bad form of legalization. But it really hasn't been a major issue, so not a dominant issue, but I'd say not a major issue in the more recent legalizations. It's mostly been these other concerns about the consequences of legalization. And it's certainly true that marijuana is very available to kids. Look at the bottom line. This is the percentage of high school seniors reporting that a specific drug is readily available or somewhat available. And that figure has been around 80 to 85% forever, literally for over 40 years. You see a lot of movement with respect to the other drugs, a clear decline in the last 20 years. But marijuana is available, and in one sense it's very cheap, in another sense it's very expensive. Marijuana costs about $10 a gram, decent marijuana. This is a weed we're talking about. $10 a gram. It's a lot more expensive than cocaine, a lot more expensive also for refined. On the other hand, if you talk about the cost of intoxication, a gram of good marijuana is about 3 joints, so for $3.50 you can get stoned. That's cheap. So, you know, when people want to say prohibition has failed, and that's not a term I use in complicated manner, with respect to marijuana, they can make a reasonable point that it's cheap compared to other forms of intoxication and it's readily available. So it's sort of the harms of marijuana and the failure, the harms of marijuana prohibition, and the sense that it has failed to accomplish its principal goal, which is to make the drug expensive, that have led to legalization. But it turns out legalization, nice sounding word, but it's not it doesn't describe a specific regime. It describes a whole array. And the array is in fact sort of in process at the moment. So you can say, look, we want to allow marijuana to be available. Let's not have black markets. You can have marijuana if you want to. And the simplest way is just allow people to grow their own. And Colorado and Uruguay allow that. Well, growing marijuana, it's not difficult, but it's a pain in the ass. And so most people just don't do it. In Uruguay, you have to register, and a few hundred people are registered to grow their own. In Colorado, you don't have to register, but the sense is that there's very few people that grow their own. Well, all right. How about, not everybody should have to go through the exercise of growing their own. Let them form clubs. And the club sort of would do this, and maybe they hire somebody to be their grow master, and you can regulate the clubs. Spain has them under sort of uncertain legal regime. Uruguay specifically allows them, the club can't be larger than 45 people, and only grow 99 plants. 10 grams, you can only get 10 grams per week as a member of the club. But it's another way of making it available. There's a little more realistic, given that people find growing marijuana difficult. You could have a state monopoly which doesn't do any advertising. And in the US, the advertising issue is clearly critical. The Supreme Court looks very skeptical at efforts to limit promotion. So alcohol advertising in the US is pretty unrestrained, and efforts by states to impose restrictions have been rejected by the court as infringements of free speech. The same thing would presumably happen with marijuana. So having a state monopoly, which is just in the business of supplying it in plain packages, or maybe even only, Climate has actually interestingly suggested no stores, you just can get it delivered, and you have to provide evidence that you are the intended recipient. And then you can have what Colorado has, which is private enterprise, and Washington State has essentially the same thing. So there are very different regimes under legalization, and how you choose them turns out to be very, very, very complicated because there are a lot of different values of it. I mean, the policy decisions that drive consumption, setting the price, issue of accessibility, of promotion, and how accessible it is. you can, and there are trade-offs, none of these dominate in terms of getting the optimal policy decisions. How will legalization of marijuana affect public health? And it's interesting, the head of NIDA, very distinguished scientist named Nora Volkow, just as adamantly opposed to marijuana legalization, and her answer is, and her reasoning is very straightforward. We know, and I think she's entirely right, that the prevalence of marijuana use will rise. Cheaper, it will be more accessible. People who take the law seriously will now experiment with them. Some of them will find it attractive. And for Dr. Volkow and a whole lot of people who work in the drug policy field, that's the end of the matter. For people like me, that's clearly not. Think of all the harms I talked about before. I mean, what do there are about 600,000 arrests per annum for simple marijuana possession. How should that weigh in our decisions as compared to an increase in the number of people who are marijuana dependent? I can't tell you how to make that decision, but I know that that's a trade-off you have to think about. Legalization includes product innovation. Half of Colorado's sales are in the form of edibles. Nobody thought of that before. I mean, you know, you can get edibles in coffee shops in Amsterdam, very legal. It's just Dutch aren't very imaginative. Americans are entrepreneurial. Okay, we can have, well, let's think about new ways of taking this drug, and they've come up with lots of new ways, and the regulators are sort of rushing now, and I think sensibly, to sort of limit the ways in which the forms in which the edibles can take. But one of the things that you can do when it's regulated is regulate the content. And it turns out that marijuana, illegal marijuana, in many countries, has changed substantially in composition. The one that you're mostly aware of is an increase in the THC content. Of comparable importance, but people only started to realize this 10 years ago, is a decline in another cannabinoid, cannabidiol, CBD. So the ratio of THC to CBD is thought to be really a determinant of sort of the adverse effects. And you may, if you put this into a legal setting, you may be that you can regulate that. And it doesn't look as though users are conscious of CBD, so you may not require an increase in CBD without having a sort of resistance. So that may be, it may be that you're shifting, sure, you're getting more marijuana use, but more use of a less harmful substance if you allow it to be legal. Then there's this issue of substitution for heavy drinking. I said that current research is quite ambiguous in the matter. And further complicated, it could be different in the short and long term. One thing I'm involved in something giving some technical advice to the Uruguay government's evaluation. And one of the things I and some others are trying to get everyone to realize is that 2 years is far too short for an evaluation because the culture of use may well change over a long period of time. Drinking pattern, we have socialized drinking patterns, they differ across countries. If parents are sort of giving guidance to children about how to use cannabis, what's a sort of responsible way of using cannabis, that's something that's going to evolve over 5 to 10 years at least. And so, the relationship with heavy drinking may be quite different in the short and long term. And by the way, let's remember, we don't know much about cannabis in terms of what's in it and its health consequences. One beef I have against epidemiologists in the US is there are all these big long-term studies of health, like the Framingham study, which has been following people decades now, detailed medical information. When I talk to them about, well, how about including marijuana use as a risk factor? Yeah, most of the people in your study used marijuana once. Wouldn't you like to? We couldn't ask about the illegal behavior. And so we just don't have those long-term studies that will allow us to say whether this is a source of risk for long-term risk for sorts of potential health outcomes. So I've made up the number 1960, but we know as much about cannabis now as we knew about tobacco before the Surgeon General's report, at best. Okay. So let me end more or less on time. So whether we're considering marijuana or new psychoactive substances, we're forced to make regulatory decisions at a stage when some harms will be known, but the assessment of the consequences of regulation is very uncertain. The current system gives no weight to pleasures of drug use, whether it's marijuana or PCP, which ignores the realities of contemporary life. We are, even New Zealand, more hedonistic than when we were sort of struggling to survive 100 years ago. We're largely middle class, walking around with new sources of pleasure, and maybe playing rugby is a much better choice than for marijuana, but gee, maybe you can have and we don't give any attention to the trade-offs between psychoactive substances, even though that's absolutely critical to these decisions. In this context, no weight given to benefits, to pleasure, clear harms associated with these substances. I believe that we will have a system that consistently generates overly cautious decisions. It's very unlikely that any new psychoactive substance will be allowed, and it may well be that marijuana legalization will not do very well because thinking about it is very much the same thing. Yes. So, discussion.
Thank you for that really fascinating talk, and I think there's a lot of issues there that we can think about cannabis that clearly is applicable to what we're trying to do with psychoactive substances. So we will allow some time now for some questions. I just want to make you aware that we've also got some posters we've just put up on the wall here that are from our study of legal high use in central Auckland after the Psychoactive Substances Act was passed. So there will be coffee available, so please feel free to mingle and ask questions and take a look at those posters as well. But if anyone had any questions for Peter, feel free to ask them now.
Yes.
Mark.
Thank you for your talk. One of the things that I was looking for was some understanding or some acknowledgement that there is a school of thought that it is not the substances that are regulated, but the substance users that are regulated. And I wonder if you might say something about that.
Interesting. I mean, not something I've never framed things that way. I guess I'm not sure I see it that way. So you could make the argument that if we take marijuana, I mean, the argument is simplest, we largely regulate youth through arrest. I've done some analyses of what's the probability of getting arrested conditional on being a user as a function of age. And it's really very clear. Youth are 7 times the risk of someone over the age of 45. I'm not sure, something like that. So you could be saying that our policies aim to control the use by particular populations. I think with the NPS, I don't think that's, I don't see that. I think we're aiming primarily at the suppliers, not at the users with NPS. We're attempting to restrict access, and it's not as though stockbrokers sort of have their own supply chain for new and innovative substances.
But stockbrokers are not the ones being stopped on the streets of New York City and asked to turn
No,
over
no,
costs.
right, but it's, I think that's, you know, you're talking about marijuana, that it's clear. Talk about the new psychoactive substances, I don't think that's the case. I think it varies by drug. Maybe. I'm not sure I have anything better to say than that.
One question that I had was that, I think it's interesting to look at alcohol as kind of a regulatory regime they're all familiar with, but a lot of people have made the point that it's actually not very effective in a lot of ways. So when we start thinking about cannabis and new psychoactive substances, I think, there's a real opportunity to be innovative and not just think about alcohol, because there's a lot of problems with the alcohol regime, and we're familiar with that.
Right, so there's a political economy argument here that says once you create a private enterprise that has both money and incentive to influence political decisions, then you know the direction in which regulation will move. And I mean, I'm making here a very American comment, but in state after state, the alcohol industry has reduced the restrictiveness of regulation. Just over a long period of time, in the case of Washington State, I forget that the big movement only happened maybe 5 years ago, after 50 years of regulation, but you can see that, and it's not just in the alcohol industry, but it's certainly, a lot of us are very unhappy with the notion, with the movement that says, let's regulate marijuana like alcohol, because we know the alcohol regulation is systematically weakened once we allow private enterprise. So I think, yeah.
Wouldn't the flip side of that be if you have a state control of, say, marijuana monopoly situation, go down the road of, say, the lottery vice in the states, where you've got now push a promotion and then states become dependent on it for revenue?
So the lottery example is a very powerful one. So states started lotteries in the 80s and 90s, and some of their advertising is just spectacular. So basically the state of California went to a stage of saying, why work? Buy a ticket. It's a fortune. Just awful. And that takes us sort of another dimension of the decision that doesn't get much discussion. Who exactly is in charge here? So in Colorado, the marijuana system, the marijuana industry is being regulated by the state revenue board. So what will they be interested in? And the fairly simple answer to that, so I didn't get into it here, but in the work that we're doing now, we're suggesting that what you really want is a public benefit corporation, in which you would have public health officials, and the goals will be expressed in the legislation that it's, the goal is to provide access, but not to promote. That would be it. No reason not to tax it heavily. In fact, there are good reasons to tax it heavily, because you want to raise the price. I mean, the price of marijuana, in the absence of taxation, will be absurdly low. It is very cheap to produce. I agree. The experience with lotteries is a reminder that a state monopoly in the wrong hands is very dangerous. But I think that there's an alternative comment. Yes.
You just, from a police perspective, and I don't equate our own police system with New York by any stretch of the imagination. We're looking at some solutions. Where I come from is that with vulnerable people, we have some big problems because you have, say, somebody with mental health problems. Those problems and where their mental health condition is carefully managed by those agencies, exacerbated by that is their access to what is now legal highs, I guess, and that combined with alcohol. So it's not so much that a lot of people will take up psychoactive substances because the word legal is attached to it, and therefore they may not have previously used anything, but because it's legal, a little bit like alcohol, it suddenly becomes socially acceptable. What we're finding now is it's leading to lots of mental health issues, which obviously we go into people's homes on a regular basis, and they might have a family member with now psychoactive substance addictions or other alcohol and drug addictions. So, what we're saying is that you can't just look at a psychoactive substance, the combination of all those with people with existing conditions does lead to schizophrenia. We've got evidence of that. It also leads to other addictions, and of course we put about 20,000 people through our custody unit, not necessarily they don't appear before the courts, but no intervention, and so nothing that we can actually do because funding and all that, those sorts of issues, to have small interventions to actually get some assistance for people who are at the bottom end starting to develop addiction issues. So I think the wider problem is a social one that's escalating now, and in 20 years' time you're going to see a significant demand on our services for those type of addictions. So it's just something else to go into the mix.
I mean, I think you make an important point, and actually I think Chris made it in his addiction article, which is you really have to look at the high-risk population separately and ask not only what are the sort of visible public health consequences, like going to emergency room with some overdose related work, but the way in which the drug can trigger mental health problems. And there's this literature on marijuana and psychosis. No doubt that marijuana, for a very, very small percentage of the population, can trigger psychosis. And in making a decision about this, you can't sweep that under the rug. But that's just sort of one element in the decision making. And I don't want to make this absurdly complicated. Most interesting public policy decisions are very complicated. But it is true that you've got to keep track of a dozen different significant indicators in making this decision. And one of them is, how does this affect this sort of what, again, I'll just call the high-risk population, who's more generally mental state will be affected by access to these drugs. I think there was some interesting, when VZP was in the sort of intermediate stage, it was allowed but not exactly legal. You said that people treated it as though it was, the government had approved it, right?
Yeah, that's right. So there was some opportunity to restrict some kind of aspects of use. One thing that's quite interesting, Mark Kleiman talks about a user license. So, and that's what I was kind of talking about in terms of innovation, that you don't have to have a strict commercial retail. You can have a user license, like a driver's license. So if you've got a license to use psychoactive substances, you can buy them. But you can take that license off people or not give it to them in the first place if they've got mental health problems or they do something that, break the law in that area. So, and actually Matt Belton has talked to me about that in terms of legal highs, that there's opportunities to have a more considered retail environment that's closer to maybe a pharmacy, where there's advice and there's also, looking at people's background in terms of should they be getting the substance.
I think one of the issues for me, as I listen to this, is that almost all of these things have been tried in alcohol. The rationing system has been tried in alcohol. what we see, as you rightly pointed out, is this gradual move away from state monopolies, away from rationing, into the private enterprise system. And I see no reason in the current context why we would not see transnational corporations producing and promoting, the substances we're talking about, which I think is, a really big underlying issue that we have to be thinking about all the time.
I think if you're looking at, licensing or giving cars, people will use that and they still drive when they're drinking that day and they still drive and they don't get a license, so I don't think that.
Yeah, I'm aware it's imperfect.
It doesn't work perfectly, but it can have some there.
I'm just aware that we're running over time, so should we leave it there? There's coffee, and I encourage you to look at our posters and talk to all the people here. But let's just take another opportunity to thank Peter for a really, really fascinating